In this example, I want to go through the weldments tutorial within SolidWorks. Come up here to this down arrow next to a question mark, and I'll select SolidWorks tutorials, and then I'm going to select all SolidWorks tutorials and come down and select weldments. And then I'm going to start out with this weldment parts tutorial, and then there's also this weldments drawing tutorial. So I'll do weldment parts, and it asks me to click here to open up a particular file, and so I'm going to open that file, and I see that there's already a sketch created. I'm going to save this as a different file name so that I don't overwrite the original tutorial file, and so we can do a file save as, and I'll put that into a particular location, and I'll call that my weldments. Okay, so I see that this sketch is already created, and let's look at how the sketch was created. So the first sketch I have is a rectangle. The sides happen to be equal, but if we want to change this to one side or another, we can use two different dimensions. And then I have a 3D sketch created off of the 2D sketch, and then a plane created up here, and a second sketch created up there. Now I want to go through and create our own sketch in a slightly different way than this sketch was created, but I think it's important to know how to create your own sketch. So I'm going to minimize this sketch, and I've started a new part file, and we'll go to the front plane and I'll do a new sketch, and I'm going to put the same rectangle in here to start with, and so I'll dimension this as 600 by 600, and by using two different dimensions, then I could change this later on to be other than square. If I always knew it was going to be square, then I could just make that equal. All right, I'm going to go a little bit different than the tutorial went from this stage on. I'm going to go to the surfaces tools, and I'm going to extrude this as a surface, and I will go backwards the same direction that the tutorial went, but let's go distance of 1000. Right, I like to change this to a different color and clear so that I can readily see that this is not a solid body, even though over here it tells us a surface body. I'm going to expand, and I will come to that surface body, and I'll select an appearance for that surface body, and I'm going to select a yellow or an orange color, and I like to make that transparent so that I can see through that. So I've created a surface body box to use as a reference. I'll turn on the visibility of that sketch number 1, so I'll show that sketch 1. And then I'm going to do a 3D sketch for the rest of my sketch. And so on the sketch tab, I'll do a 3D sketch, and I will then convert entities, and I'm going to select this edge, this edge, this edge, this edge, and this one, and let's rotate around here, and I'll select this edge as well. I think I have all the edges selected. Get this one, and so I'll say okay to that. Now you can get lost where you're at when you're in a 3D sketch. If I hit my space bar, and if I go back to front, so now there was my front view, and I will then draw a line from about right here back to about right here, and then I'm going to put the dimensions in here from this point to this point, 200, and the same dimension from here to here of 200, and then I'll finish my sketch. Now I forgot to show you how I came up with those dimensions, so let's go back to the original file and take a look at that. But before we do that, I'm going to turn off that surface body, which I may or may not turn back on. So sometimes I'll create a surface body as a keep out area or keep within area, but I also have then faces on which I can sketch as well, but without adding any additional volume to the part. So if I go back to the recent file that I had open, my weldment, and I go to the annotations folder, and I say show feature dimensions, I can see the dimensions for the part, and so that's how I came up with the dimensions to use in our new sketch. All right, so I now need to save this one, and then I can cycle through the topics. So I'm going to go to the next topic, so I can click down in the lower right hand corner to cycle forward, and then to cycle backward we'll have back arrow up here that we can go back to a previous step. I'm then going to go to the Weldments tab. And if you don't see this tab, you may need to right click on one of these gray tabs and select Weldments so that you can get access to those tools. And then I'm going to select create a structural member, and I'm going to go to ISO standard, and then for the configuration I'll do square tube, and for the size we'll do the 30 by 30 by 2.6 wall thickness. Now the tutorial says to click in groups, but as soon as you click on one of the entities, it's going to start a new group. So you could either click here, start a new group, or just click on one of the lines. It's going to start a new group. So I'm going to select these 4 lines. I've selected those 4 lines, and I want the corners to be mitered. And so I'll select here for mitered corner, and so those 4 corners are going to be mitered. So we have a choice of a N butt 1, depending on the order of our selection, N butt 2, or in this case we want a mitered joint. Right, then we can go to the next topic, and I will then select these 4 edges, but I want these to be part of a new group. So I'll select new group. And so now first 4 were group number 1. This is group number 2. I'll select these 4 edges. I'll go to the next topic, and on this one select the 4 edges in the same order that it shows here. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. So I'll do a new group, and I'm going to select 1, 2, 3, and 4. Under our end treatment, I want those to be an N butt 1, and so rather than miter, I want that to be N butt 1 on this end, and I'll select OK. Now as I was working, I missed a step on the next page, but that's not a big deal. I can right click on this feature, and I'll select edit feature, and I get back to the spot where the tutorial is continuing, and I'll select then this point, and when I do, I get this corner treatment box that comes up. Now the next couple of steps are a little bit confusing in that it says group 1 and it says group 2. This was originally our group 1, and then this was group 2, and then this was group 3. So when we get this box, it can be confusing in that it's referring to the 2 groups that are involved in this vertex right here. So it will call one of these groups group 1, and it will call the other one group 2. So these group numbers don't correspond to the group numbers that we have over here. So that can be confusing. It says for group 1 set to trim order 2, and so I'll select here. Now you may get an error because we have both of these as trim order 2, so we can only trim one thing at a time. So trim this and then this. But the results that we'll get, notice the image, the preview of the results depending on the orders in which we trim items. So I'm going to select this one and change this one to group number 1. So I'm going to extend this part over. I want this part trimmed to that part on top. I want this part on the bottom trimmed to this piece. Now when we make a weldment, if we try to square up that weldment, when we cut the original parts, we can't cut to exact lengths. So we may want to allow a gap on one side or another to account for the fact that we can't make perfect parts. Our instructions say to put this on N butt 2, and so that trims this one off to this side, brings this up to the top. So we need to decide what our design intent is, whether we want this to come over the top or we want this one come up to the top. And then I'm going to set a gap here, and we can put in whatever is appropriate for our manufacturing process. Following the tutorial, we'll put in 5mm gap. If you hit the tab key, you can preview that. So we'll put a 5mm gap here. Also, if I want the 5mm gap here, I have to go back to group 1 and set the gap there as well. Or we could put 2 different gaps. Right, so I have a 5mm gap here now. I will go ahead and accept that end treatment. So now I've brought this one up to the top, trim those 2 off. I want to do the same kind of thing down here. I want this one come down to the bottom. So I'll click on this vertex, and I will then select for trim group 1 trim order. I'll do that as 2, and for group number 2 trim order 1. So I've got this vertical piece coming all the way down to the bottom, and then these 2 horizontal pieces trimmed off. Again, you can check your results to make sure that you're getting the results that you want, and I'll go ahead and select OK to that. Now we could do the same thing on the other 2 corners, but the tutorial wants to show you some alternate techniques. So we'll go ahead and accept this at that point. Actually, it does say to repeat those steps over in the other 2 corners, but I'm going to show you an alternate technique for doing the other corners. Next, we're going to put a beam going across here, and so I'll do structural member, and I'll select this line, but instead of square tube, I want this one to be a rectangular tube, and for the size it'll be 50 by 30 by 2.6 wall thickness. Now if we look at this from the end, we see that this one needs to be rotated 90 degrees, and so we'll come down here, and for an angle we'll put in 90 degrees, and if we hit the tab key, it previews that, so we've rotated that horizontal piece around so that the height matches the previous frame members. Right, so now we need to do an end trim, and so I'm going to select trim extend, and I'll select the bodies to be trimmed. I want to trim this body, and then I'll select the face to use to trim that with. Now this face, we're going to select this face right here. This face doesn't come up high enough to trim off up here. It only goes from here to here. We have this set to allow extension, so it sees that as going out to infinity, a planar face going out to infinity. And then we need to select the type of trim we want, an end trim, a miter, a butt 1 or a butt 2. I'll leave this on end trim. I'm going to no weld gap on this one. We see the preview, and I'm going to click here to keep this visible, so I'll thumbtack this or push pin it, and I'll say OK to that end. And then on the other end, I want to allow a little bit of a gap. So again, we can't cut perfect length parts, so if we want to be able to square this thing all up, we need to make some of the members a little bit shorter and then fill that with a weld bead. So it says bodies trim. I'll trim this body, and this time for the trimming boundary, I'm going to use, instead of face, I'm going to use body, and I'll use this frame member to trim that body. And I could have it go around this curve with this option, but to cope that end, but I don't want this one to be coped. I want it to be flat, and so I'll leave it a simple cut, but I'm going to put a weld gap of 5 millimeters on this end. Now we could square that up and fill up any gaps with a weld bead. Next, I want to trim these two pieces off and extend this vertical piece up. So I'll do trim or extend, and I'll select bodies to be trimmed. I'm going to select this body and this body to be trimmed, and then under trimming boundary, I'll select bodies to use for trimming, and I'll select this body, and it'll trim both of those. I'm not going to put a weld gap on this side. I will accept that, but let's push the keep pin to keep that visible. And then I'm going to do bodies to trimmed again. I'm going to select this body, and this time I'll say to face, and I want to go up to the top of either this face or this face, and so we see that it extends that up, and I'll say OK to that one. And then I also want to check this bottom one. So this one we did when we originally created it. I skipped over that in the tutorial, so I need to do the same thing down here. So I'll do bodies to be trimmed. I'm going to trim this one and this one, and then I'll do select body to use to do trimming. I'll select this body that trims both of those pieces. I'll then do bodies to extend, select that body, and then I'll do to face, and I'll select this bottom face so that it comes down to the bottom. We have these members on the back coming up to the top, and then we have these members coming to a miter joint, and we have a 5 millimeter gap on this end, and I don't think we ever put a 5 millimeter gap when we did this one down here, so we might want to go back and change that. So you can go back in time and change anything that you need to change. So if I edit that feature and I click back on this point, and then we didn't put a gap in that one, so I'll do 5 millimeters on this one, and I also need to do 5 millimeters on that one. So I'll click on the other bot or group, and I'll put in 5 millimeters. So I'll have a little bit of a gap, and I'll select OK to that. And so now I have a gap here and a gap there. I then want to put an end cap on these two back corners, and so I'll select end cap, and I need to select the face where I want that end cap. I want it on this face. I need to set whether I want it going above that face, if I want it to go inward, or if I want it to go inside of the tube. In this case, I want it to go inward, so this will all be flush up here. And for the thickness of that cap, let's say 3 millimeters for the thickness, and then I can put in an offset value here if I want a little bit of space from the edge of the vertical tube over to the cap. And so we can either do that as a ratio of the thickness of the tube or an offset value. I'm going to offset that 0.5 millimeters, and then I'll do a corner treatment. We could do a fillet on these corners to round them off, and so if we wanted to do a fillet, let's say of 5 millimeters, we could put the fillet in there, or we can do a chamfer and we'll do a chamfer of 3 millimeters. Let's apply that, and then I'll go over to the other side and do the same thing. So I'll select this one. All the parameters should still be the same, so I'll say OK and then close that. Next, I want to put some gussets in these 4 corners, and so let's zoom in on this corner, and we don't need to see that sketch anymore, so I'll turn off the visibility of the sketches. And I might want a gap on these miters, and so I may go back and change those miters to add a gap. We've seen it. We go back in history and edit our features, so if we need to add that gap, we can go back and do that. I'm going to do a gusset, and it says select the starting or supporting faces. I'm going to select this face and this face, and so we see a preview of a gusset in here, and I'm going to make that gusset 50 in both directions. So if I hit the tab key, I can preview it, and I'll do 50 this direction. And then I can put in a chamfer. If we have a weld bead going across here, we may need to put a chamfer in there if this is welded before this part is put in there. Otherwise, that would hit up against that weld bead. So I can either have it in there and weld all of that at the same time, or I can weld these 2 members, in which case I need to have a gap in here. And so that's given, I guess, on the next page. So getting a little bit ahead of the tutorial, that I can then set this to be centered on this face. I can set it towards the front of that face or to the rear of that face, and then I can also put in an offset value from one of those faces. Then I can also, so right now we have it centered, I could have it to the front of that center, to the back of that center, or centered right down the middle. Let's put it towards the back of center. I'll push pin this to keep it in active, and then I'll select the next 2 faces, so this face and this face. All of our settings should still be the same. So I'll put a gusset up here, and one more here and here. So I've added 4 gussets in these corners. Right, so the tutorial continues on and explains that, and then we're going to put a weld bead in here. Now let's back up just for a minute. Alright, so in their example they didn't put in the chamfer, but we did a chamfer in our corners, and then we'll add a weld bead. If you don't see the Phillip Be Tool available, you may need to go to Customize, and then to Commands and Weldments, and then drag and drop that Phillip Be Tool up into your Weldments tab. So I'll then do a Phillip bead weld, and I'll leave it on 3 millimeter weld side. For face number 1, I'm going to select this face, and then for face number 2, I'm going to select this face, and I'll select this face. Now if you have a gap between these miter joints, then you'll need to do these separately. I'll go to other side, and I will select the back of this gusset as face number 1, and then for face number 2, I'll select this face again, and it previews that weld bead. I'll select this one, and it previews that weld bead. I'll say OK to that, and then continue that same process for the other 4 corners. Again, if you have a gap in here, you'll have to do these 2 separately and these 2 separately. If you want to hide the symbol under annotations, you could tell it to hide or not to display the annotations. We'll go to the next step in the tutorial, and I'm going to hit the space bar and go to the bottom view, and then we'll do a new sketch on this face, and I will then, and I'm going to do it a little bit different than the tutorial shows. I'm going to draw a rectangle about like this. I will dimension the width of this rectangle as 800. I'll dimension the vertical distance from here to the origin as 250. And the horizontal distance from here to this origin as 100. And then I'm going to do a little bit different than the tutorial. I'm going to draw a line from the midpoint of this rectangle that I drew on one side to the midpoint of the other side. I'll change these 3 lines to construction, and then I'll find the midpoint of this horizontal, or this vertical, well now vertical beam member. I'll find the midpoint of that, and then I'll select this line, and I will do a coincident constraint, and so now that is all fully defined. And so the tutorial has you mirror this line, create it, and then mirror it to the other side. I'll go ahead and accept that sketch. Then I'm going to put in a new structural member, and I'll select the SB beam, and for the size we'll use an 80 by 6, and then I will select this line, and I will select this line. Now if we look at this from the right or from the left view, notice that this beam is going through these beams, when really what I want is I want this point to be down here. So I'll come down here to the locate profile button, and then I'm going to select this point to move it down there. Now notice any one of these points that I select will move it to that sketch location. So I'll click there and I'll say OK to that, and I didn't get it moved, so I'm going to need to go back and edit that. So I'll edit that again and go to locate profile, and there, I got it that time. I don't know what I missed the first time. We can hide that sketch. You can then add additional welds, and the tutorial goes on to explain how you can push out these parts as subassemblies or individual parts in additional part files.